This week we take a look at some beginner and advanced techniques that I employed on my latest miniature. What up, mini people? If any of you guys follow me on social media, Instagram to be specific, you'll notice that I was painting a Dark Eldar Succubus. This Dark Eldar Succubus is for a painting competition called the Mengel Miniatures Second Annual Painting Competition. I like painting competitions because it gives me an opportunity to kind of break away from the norm of what I normally paint and really test myself as a painter. This video is less so about the specific paints I used and procedures, but more so about the decisions I make regarding the composition as a whole, why I pick certain colors over others, and what best suits the miniature. Now, there is a lot that goes into serious painting competitions like Golden Demon and Crystal Brush. Stuff like what miniature do you pick, what category do you enroll in, do you sculpt or do you not sculpt, do you do conversions or no conversions, and for the most part we're going to be trying to avoid that topic because that is in and of itself a video on its own. Let's get back to the painting. Mikhail Pisarski, one of my favorite painters, or better known as Lan or Lan Studio, recently put out a tutorial that you'll find in the description of this video about painting the flesh of his Dark Elf sorceresses. This guide essentially shows how he builds brighter and brighter layers of flesh with the airbrush and lets the shadows build naturally by keeping the airbrush pointed at the same angle and direction on his miniature. As you can see, my initial outcome was very subtle, almost non-existent entirely. I decided what I needed to do was further define the shadows of the flesh to kind of make the details pop a little bit more. At this point, I kind of know what the rest of my theme is because I'm painting all my Dark Eldar in a similar fashion. It's lots of warm tones, so I figured I could introduce some contrast into the miniature by shading the flesh with kind of more of a bluish tone. I took a blue tone, mixed it with the base tone of the flesh, and then started to shade the flesh parts. As you can see, this is again very, very subtle, almost non-existent. So I needed more vibrancy, I needed a better, bolder color. So I took some blue ink, which is naturally very, very vibrant, and I watered it down sufficiently, and I started to glaze that into the shadows, and bang! We're starting to get somewhere that's a little bit more interesting. Another thing to talk about is that inks generally dry a little bit glossy, so not only are you getting contrast in terms of color temperature, but you're also getting contrast in terms of finish. The normal paint's drying more of a satin, whereas the ink dries more of a glossy. At this point, I have a miniature that I can take pictures of and show to my fellow painting peers for some feedback in regards to where I am. And the resounding feedback that I got with my flesh was dead looking. It had no warmth to it at all. And in retrospect, this is pretty obvious. So I had to add some warmth to my flesh, but I had no idea how to do that. My first initial thought was to take some yellow and red ink and mix it together to make kind of a reddish orange ink, and then glaze that on top of the flesh to bring up all the skin tones to a more warmer place. Essentially, I had a gradient of flesh that I liked, from dark to light, but I needed to warm up that entire spectrum, so I thought an all-over glaze was the right choice. And boy, could I not be any more wrong. I am almost embarrassed to show you this photo, but for the sake of you learning from my mistakes, I must show you it. The Succubus looks like a clown. Not even like a good clown, like a sloppy clown that just graduated from clown school and is really terrible at clowning and got like a 1.8 GPA. It's terrible. At this point, I was pretty demoralized. I knew there was no salvaging the flesh, and I needed to restart. So I decided with a heavy heart to restart the flesh and to take what I learned from the first attempt and apply it to the second attempt. I needed a warmer flesh tone to start with, and I also needed a darker flesh tone. Starting with a darker mid-tone allows me to further push the highlights on the skin, creating more contrast for the flesh. So the flesh tone that worked out best for me in this scenario was GW's old foundation paint, TALLARN Flesh. I started to highlight the flesh in the exact same way I did the first time, adding progressively more and more white to my original mid-tone and highlighting, pointing the airbrush from the same height and angle onto the miniature to let the shadows build naturally. There was a point when the highlights got a little bit too white, and again the skin started to look a little bit dead and waxy. So I took the original mid-tone, which again is fairly warm, watered it down a lot, more so than you normally would, and sprayed it all over the miniature. This acts kind of like a glaze almost and warmed up all of the skin tones while keeping the gradient in place that I established. I wanted to stay away from shading the skin blue again, as that really didn't work out the first time. But I wanted to kind of add some coldness to it, or some richness rather. And so I decided to pick a neutral, somewhat desaturated purple. Neutral meaning that it's equal parts red and blue, not biased towards either one. And this really did work out, and I was very happy where my flesh was at this point. The shadows were deep and rich, and the highlights were a little bit brighter, really distinguishing the finer details of the succubus's flesh. At this point, I could leave the flesh alone, not work on final touching up just yet. I wanted to finish other parts of the model so that I could see how the flesh could be adjusted to better match the entirety of the composition. It's a good idea to leave your touch-ups to the end to see if you can unify the piece any more than it already is. The witch cults in my army have a tan skin suit that they wear, and I was concerned that this kind of ivory tan color would be undistinguishable from the skin of the model. And so what I tried to do initially was use more of a yellowish brown tan for her skin suit. And what happened was, next to the skin tone, it looked green or almost olive, and I really hated this. So I took my original ivory, kind of brownish tone, and base coated the skin suit, and this looked a lot better. But I still wanted to distinguish the skin suit from the flesh in some way. So I decided to pick out a shade, and you guessed it, I used blue again. The effect was something that I wasn't necessarily crazy about, but stuck around for my final piece. I highlighted the skin suit with a more warm, brighter ivory tone. The reason I did this is because sometimes it's good to make your highlights warm and your shadows cold. This again can provide the contrast that a lot of miniature painters are striving for. Well, that's all for now. We'll talk about the rest of the miniature in part 2 of this mini video series. I hope you learned from my mistakes. I most certainly did. The biggest takeaway from this video is probably you can't force contrasting temperature shadows in areas where they don't belong. Take the skin suit for example. A much more natural tone for the shadows would have been something like a brown, but I used primarily blue, and this looked kind of weird. Now, if you shaded everything on your miniature blue, like the atmosphere of the world was giving the miniature an underglow, this would look more natural and more in place, but just doing it with one piece of the miniature was very bizarre. What would have been better is to shade with a more natural tone and then glaze in very thin diluted blues to add visual interest and also add that contrast that I was desiring. At this point, you're probably sick of looking at my miniatures, so let's look at the community highlight for this week. This week we have a Space Wolf from the Reddit user Ubamoff. In fact, it's an entire army of gloriously painted Space Wolves. Holy moly, these models look fantastic. He's really nailed that heavy metal clean style that GW displays on their models. Fantastic paint job. If you guys know a mini man or woman who needs help with the final composition of their piece and could learn from the mistakes that I displayed in this video, please share this video with him or her. But if you don't want to do that, just make sure that you paint more minis. Varnishing, as it's probably unnecessary and in fact can actually harm your miniatures. Say you painted a miniature for a competition, you have all kinds of subtleties and they also detract from the realism of our piece. What we do as miniature painters to subvert this is to put terrain on these bases. That was terrible. I said so many things 8,000 times. Wife's not home, so I tried to give him a Kong and he brings it downstairs. I don't remember where I left off. You paint more minis. I used the hand with the cell phone in it. No! Son of a gun! Put that away.